Welcome to the Not So Final Frontier, a podcast created by the History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College. I'm your host, Peyton. On today's episode of Man vs. Nature, we're going to introduce you to three different stories. Firstly, how natives overcame the challenges and used nature to their advantage. Secondly, our resident San Francisco expert Dan will take you through the 1906 earthquake. And lastly, Isaac, who will examine the importance of barbed wire and the diesel engine in the West. In this segment of Man vs. Nature, I'm joined here by Megan. Today, Megan, we're going to be looking at an often forgotten group of the American West and arguably one of the most successful groups at using nature to their advantage. Can you guess who I'm referring to?
I believe who you're referring to is the Native Americans.
Yes, so John Gregory Burke was a lieutenant with the 3rd U.S. Cavalry from 1871 to 1883, and while he himself was not a Native American, he had many interactions with tribes and gained a lot of sympathy for them. Burke kept a very detailed journal of his interactions with the Southwest Apaches, Nez Perce, Sioux, Cheyenne, and the Moqui tribes. However, he spent most of his time with tribes in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, detailing the food they ate, their fishing and hunting practices, and ritualistic aspects of how these tribes operated and used the land to their advantage. Because of him, we have quite a few detailed accounts of these western tribes.
So, what can you tell me about how these tribes used nature to their advantage?
The first thing I thought that was really interesting was the distillation process of an alcoholic drink called pulque, which was produced by New Mexican tribes. These tribes had been utilizing this process for centuries. Pulque is obtained from the American aloe plant, also known as agave, in two different ways. The first method ferments the sap to create a beer-like drink that is consumed in large quantities by these tribes. It could even be mixed with strawberries, pineapple, orange, lime, and sometimes even pomegranate. In the second method, the sap is mixed with lime water and various noxious roots to make it more potent. This drink actually became very popular in parts of Texas and was sold in cantinas or bars in large quantities, not only to native populations but also to American Texans.
So you said this drink was consumed in large quantities. How intoxicating was it?
The stigmatization of pulque goes back to early Spanish contact. Christopher Columbus and Cortez reported that Indians would drink it and become drunk. Spanish sources looked at the drink negatively, saying that tribes mixed it with various roots and berries, which would make it poisonous and lead them to commit adulteries, make sacrifices to pagan gods, and commit other vices. Though the drink became popular in Texas, there were still stigmas surrounding it, especially in the 1890s with the rise of growing support for prohibition. However, the drink was extremely low in alcohol content. It's only around 2% to 4% alcohol at the most. For comparison, kombucha, which is really popular now, is about 0.5 to 1%. So getting drunk off of pulque is actually really difficult.
What else does Burke document about these tribes?
Burke actually does a really fascinating job at documenting how these native tribes of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona adapted to different foods brought to America by Europeans. While the native peoples have always used the natural resources around them, they were surprisingly fast in adopting a number of fruits, vegetables, and domestic animals into their lifestyles. One native plant in particular holds a large importance and was even mixed with European foods later. This was the nopal, or what Burke also refers to as tuna, and is now referred to as the prickly pear cactus. This is a popular delicacy of the Apaches. Women collected the fruits, carrying them in baskets on their back. They would then brush off the thorns using a bundle of stiff hay. The nopals could be dried in the sun, eaten raw, baked, or boiled. It also became part of a popular dish called queso de tuna, a boiled prickly pear mixture that Burke described as being most agreeable in taste. Queso de tuna, funny enough, doesn't actually contain cheese and resembles those little fruit leathers that you might buy in stores today.
Doesn't the prickly pear cactus have some medical uses as well?
Absolutely. This plant is promoted to treat anything from diabetes, high cholesterol, obesity, and even hangovers. In the late 1800s, though, they were more focused on its anti-scorbutic properties, which means that it can prevent or cure scurvy. The nopal was also used to help treat fevers. Many of these tribes also made their own versions of European foods, which Burke claimed to be better in taste. For example, charamushka resembles European cake or gingerbread depending on the tribe. Marcados was a variety of tea buns, and punches were identical to European donuts.
How did these natives use plants outside of food or for basic survival purposes?
Poisonous mushrooms and toadstool were used as part of ritualistic intoxication. The fungi would be brewed into an intoxicating drink. This method of consumption became known not only among the natives but also among white settlers. It actually became so well known that it was added to the Johnson's New Universal Encyclopedia in 1878 and the American Encyclopedia in 1881. The Hualupai Indians of Arizona often used intoxicants such as mushrooms, mistletoe, rue, ivy, mandrake, hemp, and opium. Mistletoe was considered to be all healing in many different cultures. Our typical idea of mistletoe, though, was brought over by the Europeans in 1900. However, there is a native mistletoe to Texas and parts of Mexico, and it was quickly adopted by the natives for its healing properties and was often used for epilepsy, as well as to aid in childbirth, tumors, ulcers, and was believed to even cure sterility. However, funny enough, its most common purpose in native culture was as feed for sheep. Wine also became a popular drink for tribes all over America. However, the tribes adopted a tradition that Burke observed of putting a hare's retinate in wine. This was a superstition believed to help get a woman pregnant. Retinate is a stomach enzyme that is produced in some mammals, mainly goats, and was also used to bind certain cheeses together and create curds.
The natives have always been experts at living off the land, but it's really interesting to see how quickly they were able to integrate some of these invasive species into their way of life and customs.
Absolutely. And with that, I turn our next segment over to Dan. Thanks to everyone for listening to this episode of Man vs. Nature.
Humans overcome challenges. We build skyscrapers and have gone to the moon. We endure hardships common in the world, those that are self-imposed and natural. The story of the native people in the Americas is a great example of this ability to overcome and endure. There are many examples of Americans overcoming hardship, but one that is particularly powerful is the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. We start with the account of one resident.
The San Francisco earthquake is an excellent example of people stubbornly refusing to bend to nature's will by not moving somewhere that doesn't routinely experience natural disasters. Instead, we all collectively sit down and brainstorm inventions that mitigate the damage caused by these disasters. Having solved that conundrum, humanity turned its indomitable spirit towards a more noble venture, breaking up the land and solidifying a class system based on the amount of property you own. This was done with an ingenious and meticulous invention that completely changed the way ranching happened. This invention was, of course, barbed wire. Yes, that's right, barbed wire. Barbed wire spelled the end of the iconic and endless age of the American West. All right, buddy, we've heard enough about what this wire did and why it was effective. We want to hear how it was invented, I hear you saying. Well, not to worry. Not only do I have the story behind its invention, it's short and sweet. Joseph Glidden was attending a fair in Illinois when he saw a wooden fence with wire protrusions designed to keep cows from knocking the fence over. His wife encouraged him to pursue his spin on the idea and had him test it by fencing in her garden. It's worth noting that Glidden wasn't the first guy to invent barbed wire, but his version was the first that was actually economically viable. Glidden won several court battles over the rights to his wire, and in a display of heretofore unrivaled smugness and poor sportsmanship, named his version the winner. You might be asking yourself, how could a piece of wire invented on October 27, 1873 kill the cowboy? Well, barbed wire brought an end to the open-range cowboy lifestyle, as it allowed farmers to build a most meticulous and composite structure, a fence. Before barbed wire was patented and sold, fences that could hold and store cattle were made from wood, which had to have been shipped across long distances. Not many trees grew in the Great Plains. It took an obscene amount of wood to build a fence large enough to hold cattle on a pasture. As you can imagine, most ranchers couldn't afford the expense. This little roadblock saw the innovation of the cowboy, a man whose job was to roam with the cattle and keep them on the cattle owner's land. This job was incredibly important, as land and cattle disputes were something that could easily end in violence even today. Though ranchers were used to running cattle over wide open spaces, the advent of barbed wire created a physical outline to cement property lines. It also kept small-time ranchers from easily driving their cattle to the slaughterhouse or railhead. Before land was fenced off, people could freely move cattle across anyone's land, and they often had to as they moved their cattle to market. Now they couldn't, and that led to the conflict we call the fence-cutting wars. These conflicts largely consisted of people trying to push private land back into the public domain by cutting fences. The fence-cutting wars were widespread across the West and not something confined to one area. Native Americans on the Great Plain were also greatly affected by the introduction of barbed wire. They traditionally lived nomadic lifestyles, meaning they moved around as they needed, but as the land was broken up and fenced in, it greatly limited where these people could move. Barbed wire brought an end to the immortal cowboy and the era of cattle drives, but that's only a single part of the Western gestalt. The next invention changed not only farming, but also changed transportation and commerce across the entire world. This device is, of course, the humble diesel engine. In 1893, in a bid to address some of the inefficiencies of gasoline engines, a German inventor named Rudolf Diesel set out to design a new engine after graduating at the top of his class from the Royal Bavarian Polytechnic of Munich, known today as just the Technical University of Munich. Diesel experimented with steam engines by conducting research into fuel and thermal efficiency. In one infamous experiment, Diesel added ammonia vapor to a steam engine, which made it explode and nearly killed him. After an ungodly number of failed experiments, Diesel was granted a patent for a new engine. Rudolf Diesel's engine was much more efficient than a traditional gasoline engine. Not only are diesel engines more efficient, they're also able to run on heavier and less refined fuel than gasoline engines. This heavier fuel is known as diesel fuel. Diesel fuel is cheaper to refine and less likely to explode when coming in contact with a source of ignition, making it ideal for military vehicles. By 1908, the first commercial truck was given a diesel engine. As a result of extremely high cylindrical pressures within a diesel engine, the first models were too large and heavy for smaller vehicles. Despite the improvements made to gasoline engines, the diesel engine has maintained its place as a viable option for the world's commercial vehicle market. But what about the world's farming vehicle market of the early 20th century, you might be asking? Well, as you can imagine, the invention and subsequent introduction of the diesel engine revolutionized farming. Test number 208, the Cat 60 was the first diesel tractor tested under the Nebraska Tractor Test Law. One of the greatest advantages of the tractor was that you only had to feed it diesel rather than the grain and water required by working farm animals. In fact, 6 acres of land had to be set aside per animal per year just to keep them fed. The change to using mechanical power as opposed to animal power made farming easier and more efficient. It also increased productivity, 2 major selling points for the tractor. But what really sold farmers on this new farming technology was the price. Because of the tight competition, companies resorted to selling tractors for less than they cost to produce, making tractors a financially viable option for small-time farmers. In 1916, around 20,000 tractors had been sold. By 1935, the number jumped to over 1 million. The diesel engine revolutionized the entire world. Everything from transportation to farming was affected by this humble invention. However, for all its benefits, the diesel engine created problems we're still dealing with today. Land covered by paved roads and air so thick with smog that a Chinese artist walked around Beijing with a vacuum for 100 days and managed to make a brick with the junk he sucked out of the air. The diesel engine and barbed wire essentially remade farming and ranching. Barbed wire broke the land into chunks, parceling and privatizing it, while the diesel engine allowed farming to be done at a scale never before seen and certainly not achievable by a single person. These 2 inventions spelled the end of the American West and created the world we know today. That concludes our segment on man versus nature. Be sure to check out our other segments for more history on the American West. Thanks for listening to The Not So Final Frontier.